Delighted to welcome Duncan Geddes, who has lectured at the Institute off and on over the last 5 years whilst he's been fully resident here, having been associated with Florence through marriage for over 50 years. Duncan has recently been promoted to the title of Emeritus Professor of Medicine at Imperial College London. He retired to Florence from a highly successful and prestigious career as a physician, and in his retirement is spending a lot of time studying the history and the art and making some art himself. He's an all-rounder. So I'm delighted to pass the word to Duncan Geddes for his lecture on ward round at the Uffizi.
Thank you very much, Simon. Can I just check that you can hear me at the back? Okay. If I want to just start by saying, if you've been to picture galleries, as I have, with a whole range of different friends, the thing you learn straight away is that everybody looks at pictures in a different way. If you go with a painter, he will give you technical details about brush strokes, about composition, about color balance, and about the importance of drawing from life, Charles. And if you go with a cook, you'll learn all sorts of things about. Hello? Hello?
Duncan, from the Zoom, it's better when you're closer to the microphone, because when you're far from the microphone, it's a little bit faint. Yeah?
Okay. If everybody can hear.
That's great.
If you can't hear, please shout again. So I was just saying that if you go to an art gallery with different, no? I'll put it virtually in my mouth. Is that better? Yes, I can hear that. I can hear myself now. Another book. Okay. Try again. Is that working now?
No.
Right. So painters will talk to you about technical things. Cooks will notice pots and pans and fruit and vegetables. And if you go with an art historian, they will know an enormous amount and be able to tell you about paintings in a way that you would never be able to know by yourself. And I just want to start by saying I'm not an art historian at all. I'm a doctor. And I've spent more than 40 years in hospital medicine. And during that time, I've seen an enormous number of bodies, healthy bodies and unhealthy bodies, elderly bodies and young bodies. And so I'm something of an expert on bodies. And if I go around the Uffizi, the thing that strikes me straight away is just how many bodies there are, most of them naked. And so when I go around, I cannot avoid going around as a doctor and doing a ward round. And I start to see things that other people wouldn't necessarily have seen or wouldn't have given any importance to. And I want to just start with two examples. Unfortunately, I need technical help. Technical help, please. Okay, I have technical help. If you go to the first floor of the Uffizi, when you have become rather tired on the second floor, you will pass this painting by Salviati, and you'll pass it by, and you won't notice anything particularly special about it. When I walk past, it hits me in the eye. I see something wrong with the right breast. And it doesn't look very striking there, but if you go and look very close, you can see that that breast is drawn in and puckered and has some swelling above the nipple and another swelling above that. And this looks exactly like a breast cancer. I've no idea whether it was a breast cancer. The Salviati worked with Michelangelo, and if you go to the Medici tombs, you'll find his sculpture of Night also shows a distortion of the right breast, which may be a breast cancer. So it could be the same model has been used. We'll never know. But that's just one example. Here is another. I'm sorry, but I'm not getting. I'm going to have to ask for help again. For some reason, this is no longer. Okay. I'm back in the Uffizi and I'm looking at Sustermann's portrait of Galileo. And most people will see Galileo looking at the stars, and I cannot help but see he has a pigmented spot on his left cheek. And I'm worried about it because that could be the first sign of a melanoma, which is a particularly aggressive skin cancer. And if he came to me as a patient, I would then say, how long have you had it? And he would reply, I don't know. And I would then say, have you got any photographs to see whether it was there before? And in the case of Galileo, we do have, because about 10 years earlier, Leone did a portrait of Galileo and it wasn't there. So speaking simply as a doctor, I'm not making a diagnosis, but I have seen something that worries me. What I know now is that he didn't die of cancer. He died of a broken heart and loneliness. So he probably never had cancer. But that's just to introduce you to the way that I would look at paintings. If I go to the Uffizi and listen to what people are saying about the paintings, a very common comment is, the Madonna looks beautiful, but there's something wrong with the child. And I'm now going to show you 3 examples of why people think something is wrong with the child. This is the Master of Greve, where the child is not a child at all. It's a small man. And that was the traditional way of painting the Christ child from the Byzantine tradition onwards. And so that's left over. We're now in 1230. If you go to the Pitti and you look at this Botticelli, you see a baby that is frankly enormous. It's far too big to be in the mother, and certainly too big to be born. So there are things to explain. I'm now going to go north of the Alps and show you a picture by Van Eyck. And here you see a most disturbing baby. So this is what people mean when they say there is something wrong with the baby. Could be too big, could be too small, but this looks like an imp or a sort of devil. But before moving on, just notice the similarity between the Christ child and the lamb at the bottom of the painting. The lamb also looks scrawny, too small, malformed. And the painter can paint, so it isn't that he just doesn't do it very well. He has done this for a purpose. And as we go through the Christ child, I want to keep reminding ourselves that the painter's main job is not naturalism, though my job as a doctor is to look at the painting in that way. I was just preparing this talk and somebody said to me, well, on a ward round, before you went to the neonatal ward, you would always ask a question of were there any difficulties or abnormalities in the pregnancy? And the answer is, in this case, this is Piero della Francesca, the Madonna del Parto. The pregnancy was extremely unusual in that it was a virgin and the conception was by the Holy Spirit. And therefore, to be looking at the Christ child as a normal baby would be naive for me. The Christ child has to carry with him all sorts of other responsibilities within the painting. He has foreknowledge of his death, he has to inspire devotion, and he has to tell a biblical story. And I'm going to use the sequence of biblical stories to see how the Christ child is portrayed at different stages in his life and development. So we're going to look at day 1 at Nativity, a number of Nativity paintings. We're going to look at him when he's 6 days old, Circumcision, a number of circumcision paintings. Then to day 12, 6th of January, the Adoration of the Magi. And then he's now left hospital, and we're going to look at him as it were when he comes back to the outpatient department for a 1-month check, the presentation at the temple, and a 3-month check at the time of the flight to Egypt. just to orientate ourselves, I'm worried now about size and proportions. And this is a picture of a newborn child being held by the mother. And we know the size of the mother's hands from the wrist to the fingertips. It's about 27 centimeters. And we know the average the average length of a newborn boy, which is about 50. So the length of a newborn boy is about 2 mothers' hands. So we can look at that as we go through. The other important thing to remember is that a child is not a small adult. The proportions are completely different. And this is from a book on sketching, where you can see that the proportionate child has a large head and short legs, as compared with an adult. And if you draw a child as a small adult, it looks absurd with a small head and long legs. And we'll see some examples of this. Now, there is a picture of a newborn baby girl in this instance, lying on her back, waiting to be measured. There is the measuring tape. And this is a fairly usual thing to do in a hospital. The child is laid on its back, measured, quickly checked for any abnormality. And this is an important image because we're going to see a lot more of the child lying on his back on the ground. And look particularly at the arms, which are stretched out. Look at the legs, which are juggling about. One foot is held up, the other down, and he's crying. She's crying. And this is what you see almost every time with a newborn child. The newborn child is not happy to be lying on his back away from the mother. And here on the right, I've listed the different stages of child development, because we're going to be comparing the child development with the paintings at the different ages. A child does not smile until about 2 months. If your mothers in the audience will tell me that my child smiled a little bit earlier, but this is average. At 3 months, the child can hold its head unsupported, but before that it cannot. And you remember holding a child, you're always told to hold the head. At 4 months, it can reach out and hold a toy, and at 6 months can sit unsupported and can stand at one year. So that's a sort of way of looking at what a normal child would do, and then we're going to compare the Christ child with a normal child. And let's start in San Marco and start with Frangelico. Frangelico for me is wonderful for this particular lecture because he tells the story so well. He often tells it schematically, so it isn't completely naturalistic. But if you look at the ox and the ass, you know at once it's an ox and an ass. They're not very good portraits of oxes and asses. The ass is far too slim. But you know where you are, and you know that this is the Mother of God adoring the Christ child, who is lying on his back on the ground. Joseph is adoring as well. And you've got the story, and we're there to adore the Christ child. I'm now going to be doing a ward round and looking at the Christ child to see what is normal and what is not normal. First of all, the proportions are wrong. The head is too small and the legs are too long. He is very calm. He wouldn't normally be so calm. He's holding his head up, unless you think that you can rest your head on a halo. But a halo is light, and so that shouldn't really work. And his arms are particularly interesting because they're not the arms of distress like the child you saw. They're the arms of a priest giving a blessing, or of Christ giving a blessing. So here he has other jobs to do. Light is coming from in his entire body. And so my medical way of looking at it is obviously wrong. He is wrong for a normal child, but he's right for a Christ child. Now look at another picture by San Marco, and you get a completely different story. This is a disturbing painting. The architecture is all distorted. The Madonna is not a happy, adoring Madonna. She's a worried Madonna. The Christ child is far too long, about 4 hands worth, and the ox and the ass are in a disturbed posture. So this is a painting that's telling us a completely different story for the same event. And if we look closely at the child, we see a child in distress. I don't think he's blessing, he could be. The proportions are again wrong, but he's a child in distress. And is he in a manger or is he in a tomb? He's probably in a tomb, and he's foretelling his death. And the whole picture is telling us about his passion and his crucifixion rather than about his nativity. Right, back to the Uffizi. And before talking about the Christ child, just look at the still life in the front. Absolutely brilliantly, meticulously done. And look at the shepherds at the side. Again, this is just to show how brilliant the painter Van der Goes is at naturalistic painting. But when he comes to the baby, as I walk past this painting, I want to get that child into intensive care. I'm worried about, there's something badly wrong with the child. Let's look at him a bit more. He looks in distress, possibly dehydrated. His legs are a bit agitated. His arms are up, but not blessing. And he looks perhaps comatose. Now, in that, I have to understand that there is a religious message being given to me, and I'm probably being made to be concerned and distressed about him because he's vulnerable and he's going to die, which is exactly the message that I've got, except I want to react to it in a different way. He is important because he's a Northern European painter. And we're now going to look at some other Christ childs by Northern European painters, and see how they're very, very similar to each other. These are Roger van der Bayden, and you see this scrawny, malnourished Christ child, rather too long, head too small. Here the head is bigger, but distorted. And in both cases, they look wrong. They look ill and they look wrong, and they're probably meant to. In particular, and here I'm going to make another argument, this baby, if I saw this baby on a ward round, I would say, are you absolutely sure it's alive? The baby looks dead to me. And here are two more, same artist, same child, exactly the same child. It's a child that is almost taken from a copybook. So if you then ask the art historians, the answer is they used a copybook that usually the journeyman artist would carry with him his model book from which he would take examples. And because he would often be able to find a woman to sketch, you wouldn't be able to find a baby to sketch. And so the same baby appears in many different paintings and nearly always looks ill to me. Here on the right is St. Luke, who was an artist sketching the Mother of God. And I've just put it in to emphasize that the painters at the time did sketch from life, but when it came to the baby, something else was going on. The model book is likely to be many years, many decades older than the time that the artist is painting. And go back 100 years from this and you hit the Black Death. So is it possible that the copybook actually had sketches of dead babies in it? Because that's what it looks like to me. We'll never be able to find out. After those gloomy thoughts, let's go back to Italy. And isn't this a relief? From all those scrawny, malnourished, worrying babies, you get, this is Ghirlandaio in Santa Trinita, and Ghirlandaio has clearly sketched babies from life. He's sucking his thumb, he's not doing godlike things, he's not blessing. His legs are a bit too plump and a little too long, but that is clearly a Florentine artist who is sketching from life. But I've shown him small first. You then go to the whole painting, and of course the painting has a lot of other work to do. And so I'm only focusing on the naturalistic part. Look at the manger. The manger isn't really a manger at all. It's a sarcophagus. And written on it in Latin is, "The urn that conceals me shall bring forth a God." So we're being told a story of God being born a man. And then obviously there's a lot of other things going on, but a very good donkey. Right, I want to now leave the neonatal ward and go to the operating theatre. And we're going to look at a minor operation being done on the baby Jesus on day 6, which is his circumcision. And once again, I'm starting with San Marco with Frangelico, because he tells the story so well. Everything you need to know is there. And before we concentrate on the action, just notice the water jug for clearing up any mess, the tray for any blood that will drip, cloths, aprons. It's all there, but there are things which are odd. You go close to, you would never do an operation in midair like that on a hovering baby. So this is entirely schematic. The baby is being held correctly by the mother in a sort of leg splayed, which is reasonably correct by Joseph. And the operator is wearing an operating cap, which is exactly what we do. The idea is that hair can carry bacteria and should not be allowed to flop into the wound. In this case, his hair is far too long, and there is a problem with a beard. There are still problems with beards now as to whether they should be covered over. Now, particularly, I want to draw your attention to the knife. These look like arrowheads, and it tells me that Frangelico really knew his Bible, because I've looked this up, and in the book of Joshua, it tells you how to do a circumcision, which is that you use a stone of flint to do the circumcision, which is actually a brilliantly sensible thing to do. If you hit a flint, which is basically glass, with a hammer, you will get an extremely sharp edge, which will be sterile and will probably be better than a rusty knife that has been sharpened 3,000 years ago. So there is evidence that Frangelico read his Bible. Let's go north of the Alps, and you see this horrible painting, which I've chosen really for 3 reasons. I mean, the poor Christ child. Look at this gigantic knife, quite inappropriate for the job, but maybe making a symbolic point. Look at his operating glasses. This is wonderful because it's exactly what we do at the moment. He's wearing his surgeon's cap, keeping his hair in. He is not, should be. And then we've got this little cup here, this pot, which, seen as a modern doctor, that is the specimen pot where the foreskin is going to go. And the destination of the foreskin is extremely important in these paintings because it's going to be a relic. It's the only relic that comes directly from the body of Christ. And as you know, with relics, there are an awful lot of foreskins out there. And but it probably isn't a specimen pot. It probably is the a thing called a pyx, which is a pot for holding the communion bread. And he is about to bleed. And so we're going to have symbolism of the body of Christ, the bread, and the blood of Christ after the circumcision is done. Dürer is a great painter for naturalism. And here you see a distressed child, again in midair, a gigantic knife. He's not a happy child. He looks far older than his 6 days. But again, the detail of the jug and the tray are good. The Mother of God is particularly good here. This is exactly what a mother looks like when the child is being operated on. She's praying and she's in some distress. I've chosen this Bellini because this is a brilliant portrait of a child in pain. Look at the way he's clenching his fists and he's looking, his head is arched back. You'll see this in veterinary medicine again. If you do something to a dog, they stiffen up and their head goes back. And that's exactly what a child in pain looks like. Again, showing that end of the 15th century, the painters are seeing babies and not just as objects, they're seeing them as real living beings. I've included a circumcision by Mantegna for a few reasons, partly because this child is so charming on one side, partly because the Christ child now is doing exactly what you would expect a baby to do. He's not allowing an operation to happen in midair, he's clinging to his mother. The operating assistant is doing a job well. Joseph has brought with him 2 doves, which you can see in the basket, which I think is just a mistake, because the 2 doves come at the time of the visitation, or not the visitation, sorry, the presentation at the temple as a payment to the, and they are not usually a payment for a circumcision. Let's just look at the scalpel. Perfect. Being held in the right way, it's about the right size. So this is medically good. And the almost final one in the circumcision section is this by Guido Reni. And I've chosen this because of the look at the face of the Christ child. He's making eye contact with the angel. And this is medically so good, because if you're going to do an operation on a small baby, you want to distract it. 12 days, 6 days, this is almost impossible, but you get the baby, look at the birdie, and the baby will look away and hardly notice what you're doing to it. So it's a particularly good portrayal of nature and how a baby would behave. A gory one to finish, and thank you, Carl Strelka, for this. This is just to make the point that I've made before. Carl saw this in Gubbio over the weekend and sent it to me. And here you see a very bloody circumcision going on. Extra bloody, I mean, it would never be as bloody as that. And this is to make the bleeding, passion, crucifixion point. Right, enough of the operating theater. We now want to go to the Adoration of the Magi, day 12. And I won't repeat every time that the baby looks far too old. None of these babies look like 12-day-old babies. The interest here is something different. It's not only the, oh my God. I'm afraid he's come back. Thank God for that. Frangelico again. There are 3 of them. Gold, there's the gold, frankincense, and I think myrrh is at the back. Myrrh is used in embalming dead bodies. So this is a gift with a prediction in it. But particularly important in this, and here there is a good book in the British Institute Library, which is hard to find, about the way that the Christ child and the Christ child's sexual organs have been painted but not paid attention to. And the book is paying attention to it, as, so he thinks, is this particular wise man. He may be touching and looking at the feet, but is he looking and inspecting the baby? If you look at some others, this is in the National Gallery, Bruegel, the child very appropriately screwing himself away from the stranger. And what is the stranger doing? He's not giving a present at all. He's looking at the baby. And the argument here is that the Magi, if you remember, went to Herod on the way and said, "Where is the king of the Jews?" And Herod said, "Go and find him and check him out." So these are the biblical story here is that the Magi are actually checking that he is a human baby, not a god, and that he's a boy. And so this is a ritual inspection going on. And once you've seen this, you see it everywhere. This is Galileo in the Uffizi. And you can see that the Madonna is actually pulling apart the legs, and the Magus is pulling apart the clothes so that he can have a good look. So there is actually much more going on than just the presentation of gifts. It's a particularly good baby, this, but not 12 days old. I want to finish this section with Leonardo, because Leonardo is obviously very famous for drawing from life and sketching not only parts of the body, but also complete bodies and anatomy. And here I can make 2 points. First of all, that the child is reaching out and grasping, something that would not normally happen until 4 months, certainly not 12 days. The other thing, which I find completely charming, is what the right hand is doing. Now, I don't know how many of you have had children and had children who comfort themselves by touching the side of their head, but it's a fairly characteristic gesture, possibly because touching the side of the head feels like snuggling up against the mother, possibly because it's a sensation that started in the womb and gives some sort of comfort. And I think we're seeing here Leonardo sketching a real baby doing an absolutely everyday thing. And as far as I know, nobody's really drawn attention to this, but a lot of other people have noticed it happening. And here is the slide for the dogs in the audience. This is Linus, and every time you see Linus, he's touching the side of his head with his security blanket. And Leonardo got there first. We're now going to go to the, as it were, the outpatients department and the presentation at the temple. And here I'm shifting a bit. I'm not looking so much at the Christ child's body. I'm more interested in his development, his nutrition. Is he growing well? Is he beginning to behave well? And here are 2 examples. I particularly like this Russian icon, partly because it's the smallest baby I found.
Oh, it's different here.
Hello? Sorry, I missed that. This is the presentation of the temple. The priest is being correctly worshipping. Joseph has brought with him the 2 doves, appropriately this time. And the mother-child bonding seems to be satisfactory. Then you go across to Germany and you see Holbein, a very strange painting this. Would you take your child naked to the first time it's out of the home, back to the hospital, or to being presented at the temple? Difficult to understand why. And this baby does not look like a well, healthy, happy baby. So I'm concerned about that, and I don't know what is going on. But again, it's painted by a painter who did it absolutely on purpose. I'm now checking these 2 for 2 things. For the activity of the baby. Is the baby doing things a lot? Is he moving around? Is he an active baby, which will mean a healthy baby? Well, in Giotto's case, definitely yes. He wants to get back to mother. And he's gesturing across, he's active, and he's properly clothed. So I'm medically very happy about him. I'm a little bit less happy about this baby by Lorenzetti. He's bundled up in a lot of clothes, more than it's probably necessary, and I'm coming to swaddling in a moment, and he looks very flat, very inactive. So there's a sort of contrast there where happy on the left, want to have a better look on the right. And then we come to Bellini and Mantegna again. And Bellini's presentation, the mother is, it looks like good mother-child bonding, but the child is inexplicably naked. And because I'm a doctor, I have to look and see if he's circumcised, and it appears that he's not. And when you go back through all these pictures of a naked Christ after circumcision, I can't find one where you can see evidence of circumcision. And that raises the possibility that the painters had never actually seen circumcision, because it would have been only in the Jewish community, and the painters are painting in a Christian community, and so they didn't know what to paint. It's difficult to see any other reason. Mantegna, in contrast, produces a heavily swaddled baby, and this is medically bad. If you go into the history of swaddling, it's present in almost all cultures at some stage. It's not just a European or a Middle Eastern culture. Swaddling is a very usual thing to do to a baby. You can see it in Latin America, you can see it in Mexico, you can see it in many places. And the advantages of swaddling are obviously you keep the baby warm, but there is quite good evidence that the baby settles more and sleeps more easily and cries less when swaddled, which is very nice for the mother, but not particularly good for the child, because the child is not learning to move and is very inactive. There used to be an idea that swaddling a baby would help it grow straight limbs. That turns out to be completely untrue. And medically, the arguments against swaddling developed in the 17th century, and it's now pretty universally frowned on. So happy but unclothed on the left, and not entirely happy and speak to the mother on the right. Right, the last section is the flight to Egypt. And this was a fairly popular topic in the 14th and 15th century. And here you have Duccio, mother riding side saddle on the ass, holding the baby. And basically the same pattern. Baby is usually swaddled, usually being held fairly passively by the mother. Mother is always side saddle. And I've spent some time looking for side saddle examples, for women riding astride, and you can find them, but they're nearly always warrior women, whereas riding side saddle seems to be universal for this particular iconography. Here is the final journey to Egypt, and it's very, very odd. Here again, you see an apparently ill, possibly dead baby being carried in a totally unnatural way by the mother. And if the explanation is that this is a child foretelling his death, the same is true of the donkey. So I think this is probably, and I'm grateful to Charles Cecil on this, probably just the very odd style of cosmetura, and not actually meant to be conveying that art historical message. After about 1450, the flight to Egypt became less often painted, but a rest on the flight to Egypt became more often painted. And I'm going to give you two examples of this. It's a non-biblical event. It's an entirely subsequently invented event. But this is particularly nice because here is the Christ child at the age of 3 months, far too early. Children do not play with each other until they're about 1 or 2, but far too early, playing with a whole lot of other children, all of whom are angels. And I'm putting this in really in contrast because I've been talking a lot about the foreknowledge of death. But it's nice to know that Saint Filippo Neri is the patron saint of joy, and his mantra was vivere con allegria. And here for once is the Christ child having a good time. I'm going to finish with one final flight to Egypt, resting on the flight to Egypt, because this, partly because it's just such a wonderful painting, but also because medically so much is going well. You see perfect mother-child bonding. You see Joseph involved. Rather than abandoning a single mother, he's clearly very much involved in childcare. This is going to be good for the baby. The baby's breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is, everybody knows this, but is the best way of feeding. It's completely sterile, it's nutritious, it encourages immunity, and it's also quite a good contraceptive. So spacing out the family, though this is possibly not relevant in this case. also exposing children to animals early in life reduces the frequency of allergy. So on every medical level, this is a great painting. But it's also an easy one for me to end on, because I've been looking all the time simply at the body and the health of the body and the development of the body. If I were really interested in palm trees, I would probably have a lot to say about the palm tree, or women's hairstyles, or clothes, or landscapes. And so my fundamental point is that if you take with you to an art gallery your own particular interests, your own particular expertise, you will spend much longer with every painting, and you will get much more from it. And it's been a lesson to me to realize how much I've learned just from going on a ward round. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much all the people who helped me. And this is a mixture of pediatricians and art historical experts. So thank you for everybody, and I'm pleased to say that they will be immortalized online by this. So thank you very much. Now, very happy to have any discussion, questions. Could we perhaps have lights?
Thank you, Duncan. And as always, it's question and answer time. I'm going to let Duncan be the master of ceremonies because I'm not there. But the protocol, just to remind everybody, is anyone in the room, just put your hand up and someone will bring you the microphone so that people on the Zoom can hear. And if you're on the Zoom and want to intervene, you have two routes. One is to simply unmute yourself and speak, or put something up in the chat and either myself or Duncan or someone will read it out. So over to the Q&A session. I'll get it rolling. Duncan, I mean, the middle-aged men who were so prevalent in the medieval period, they seem to disappear substantially when you get into the Renaissance period. Is that the case?
What, within the paintings?
Yeah.
Frankly, I don't know. I haven't sort of looked at that. I've been concentrated on the baby.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I meant the baby represented as a middle-aged man.
See, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, the baby as a small man disappears in about 1300, and it becomes more naturalistic afterwards. But the proportions are still very often the proportions of a small man. So he isn't. It's just a proportionate thing. The earlier ones, he's clearly a man, and he's doing man things. Sorry, I misunderstood.
Because of the impossibility of Jesus, who's now God, ever being really a baby, I suppose.
Well, I think it's a time of transition where naturalism is coming in for all sorts of reasons, and it's then accepted more readily that Christ is God, but he's also human. I think in the earlier ones, he's God, and no real. I mean, if you go right back, there is a painting in the 3rd century in the catacombs in Rome, where the Christ child looks very like a Renaissance baby. He's being breastfed, he's got a halo, and you could easily put him into the 15th century. So it was obviously a tradition that then developed away from naturalism in Rome, and the symbolism and the fact that he's a god took over as the most important feature.
Whilst people are thinking of questions or comments, one from Antonio Whiteley in the chat. Duncan, please can you give the author and the title of the book which you alluded to regarding looking at the genitals of the Christ child?
That's Leo Steinberg. It's called The Sexuality of Christ, published in 1983 and subsequently updated. I mean, it's a wonderful book. Whether you agree with, I mean, he overstates in many people's view the sexuality in a number of different things. I've only mentioned one of them, there are others. but it makes you realize that most of art history beforehand never mentioned it at all. And so he makes a very good point, possibly exaggerated.
I just thought this was really fascinating to be looking at the Christ child so intensely, I guess, because in many of these paintings that you were showing us, we look at the overall painting and we kind of glimpse by, but when you actually really focus in on how the baby is portrayed, it's very, very unusual and very, very different. I think in one of your paintings where you were doing the circumcision section, the child looked almost like a 6-year-old, not a 6-day-old. You know, he was a big kid.
I think it's a universal thing that the age of the child is relatively irrelevant to the painter. But I find that interesting because the person who was going to look at the painting, who would often be an illiterate peasant who'd seen a lot of babies, would have presumably been a bit troubled by that, but then would have had to take on trust that, oh, well, it doesn't really matter because he's a god, and which is that gets you out of everything.
Brenda wants to ask something from the Zoom. So can we unmute Brenda and off you go?
Hello, good evening. I just wanted to compliment you on this lecture because I'm a medical doctor and an art historian, and I've attended, I wouldn't say very many, but a number of lectures where medical doctors have tried to look at paintings and interpret disease from them without considering, which of course you've done, what were the concerns of the painter. And so I appreciate very much that you have done that. I just wonder, it would be lovely if you could turn your attention maybe to some other figures in Renaissance painting. For example, you know, why the Virgin Mary is always portrayed as a non-Eastern, Middle Eastern woman. You know, she's portrayed quite differently. Have you any comments on that?
Well, apart from agreeing with the observation and agreeing with you that once you start looking at paintings in this way, you can almost never stop, because I've got a nice portfolio of miracles and wounds and martyrdoms. You could play the same level of interest with crucifixions. And I think in each case, I don't want to exaggerate the importance of looking at one part of the painting. You still have to look at it all. But the big advantage in going there with a particular interest is you interrogate the painting and you look all over it, and you begin to see things that otherwise you wouldn't have noticed. It is possible that you miss some of the aesthetics of it. The construction of the painting may sometimes get lost by looking at too much detail. So I'm open to that criticism.
Thank you.
Sorry, just one other thing. There's quite a big literature of doctors finding diagnoses in paintings. But the problem with that is there's a big so what to it. Unless you are particularly interested in the history of the plague, for example, that could be very important. But otherwise, to just say that she probably had breast cancer doesn't move anybody much further forward.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with you.
Well, another one in the chat, which I'll read out from Nancy S. Love this talk. It's my hobby to travel around Italy and photograph what people, what's called in one website, ugly Renaissance babies, and wonder why they're pictured that way. You've answered some of my questions.
Well, I mean, I can only comment that I've had exactly the same enjoyable experience, and it's not going to finish. There's so many of them. I suppose part of the weakness of this argument is that once you've got a bee in your bonnet, you can find a painting that satisfies it, because there'll always be a painting somewhere that supports any point of view.
Wonderful lecture, Duncan. I was wondering, once women who were mothers started painting, do you think they did a better job?
Yeah.
Somebody like Artemisia Gentileschi, who I think had 5 or 6 children.
Very good question, and I don't know. There's an extremely good Gentileschi breastfeeding picture where the child, I mean, this is interesting, where the child looks far too old to be breastfed. But then I'm told by a friend in the audience that he, Italian, that he used to go to the park with a lot of other children, and when it came to Eleven's time, the merenda, a lot of the 6-year-old mothers would pull out a breast and feed the child then, because it was much more convenient than taking a lunchbox with you. So breastfeeding may go on much further in history than one realizes.
Excellent lecture. So now that you've done all this research on the baby and the age, do you personally find a point in the art historical time where the adult child, the adult looking child, who is symbolic of God and would be communicated, that the painter was communicating that idea to the illiterate, versus I guess the question is there a point in time in art history where the symbolism gave way to the naturalism? Have you identified in your own head a time that happened?
I think it's entirely progressive, and it does depend where you are as well, whether you're in Italy or whether you're in Germany. Naturalism is very strong in Germany, and often more so than in Italy. But I haven't gone beyond the age of 1 year, and it would be very interesting to go. There are fewer paintings of Christ after 1 year old, and so it would be more difficult to do. But a very interesting question that I can't do more than agree it's interesting.
Brenda's partner wants to ask something. Unmute, sir. Unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, to say I thoroughly enjoyed that lecture. I'm also an emeritus professor of medicine, but from Trinity College in Dublin. And my point really is a comment, really, nothing to do with the lecture per se, but it's interesting that in circumcision, the people who carried out the circumcision, in other words, Jewish people, understood the genetics of hemophilia about 2,000 years before we did, because the patriarch Judah said that women who had 2 children who bled after circumcision, if they had a 3rd male child, didn't have to have them circumcised. So it's just an interesting point.
Very interesting. If I can just give you another, I spent a lot of my career with cystic fibrosis, where the children have unusually salty sweat. And there is actually, within the German literature, is the statement that if your baby tastes salty, he's bound to die. So there are folk associations that are way ahead of the medical.
Another comment in the, it's come up in the chat from David Hansel. Great talk, Duncan. Is there a possibility that the phenotype, including proportions, of newborns has changed over the last 600 to 1,000 years? Unlikely, I suppose, but on the other hand, adults have got longer over a shorter time frame, i.e. since the 19th century.
Thank you, David. David is a great friend and colleague. He's a radiologist that I've worked with in London, whose opinion I respect and whose questions I fear. It is possible. There are actually, I have looked at the relative size of women and men over the last 3,000 years. And the big growth spurt is in the last 100 years, that actually weight and height have remained remarkably constant beforehand, but that doesn't necessarily apply to shape.
Whilst we're waiting for more questions, I'm going to put in my weekly reminder to my fellow Zoom participants that you're allowed to Zoom into Wednesday lectures without any registration fee. But if you felt minded to make a donation of whatever size you liked, it would be much appreciated to help keep the series going. Thank you for that.
So wonderful talk. When you were talking about the sort of medical equipment that was on the scene for the circumcision, it occurred to me that in all of the many nativity scenes, there's no paraphernalia relating to recent childbirth, whereas say in the scenes of the birth of the Virgin or the birth of John the Baptist, you see the mother postpartum in bed eating her first, you see some of the childbirth stuff. And why do you think we don't?
Well, I've noticed that as well. I think it is because the nativity is such an important theological point that just swamps everything else. Whereas some of the later events, Christ he's established as a God, but the miracle of the virgin birth and the birth of a God is so important that it probably takes over from any possible naturalism. It's where I particularly like Frangelico, because he tells the story very well, but I don't, as far as I know, never tells the story of the birth itself.
Any more on the Zoom? Duncan, have you got activity in the room? Is it people bursting to talk?
They're looking quite thirsty, actually.
I was wondering whether we were getting to that stage. I'm now in the unenviable position of all the followers on Zoom of having to thank Duncan for his great intervention, announce that those in the room will now have the opportunity to drink some of the delicious Sonino wine that we've got for this season. I'll ask you to welcome the new people as well as talking to your old friends as the party gets going, and remember to open the window, please, to get some new air in. If people will help to move some of the chairs away from where the window and the drinks table is, so that we can have space to circulate safely whilst you enjoy your wine. So thanks to everyone who's joined us on the Zoom. And see you all next week, either on Zoom or in the room. I plan to be in the room myself, and anyone who's in Florence, please do come on down to the library. We're having a lot of fun in the library these days. But just to really wind it all up, Duncan, that was fabulous. It was really, really interesting and well put together. And I think we'll just give you a round of applause. Yay. Thank you very much. And so I think that's probably goodbye from us Zoomers, and enjoy the party, those who are in the library. Good night, everyone.